I am 84 years old. For 62 years, I have carried a silence that has defined the second half of my life more than any word I've ever spoken. My name is Silas Patterson. My father taught me to track deer before I could write my own name. My grandfather guided hunting parties through the Cascade Range when it was still unmapped territory. I was born to the woods. In the summer of 1962, I walked into those woods a hunter. I walked out something else. I never fired a rifle again. I never returned to that forest. For 6 decades, when friends asked why, when my own sons asked why, I gave them the same answer. The woods aren't the same anymore. They thought I meant logging. They thought I meant roads. They let it go because that's what men of my generation did. We didn't press. We didn't pry. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't experience what I experienced. 3 weeks ago, I found something at the edge of my property. A small wooden figure, carved from cedar, placed carefully on a flat stone near the tree line. Crude but deliberate. The third one in 15 years. I live 127 miles from where the encounter happened. I've lived here for 18 years. They know where I am. I'm telling this now because the silence I kept to protect them, and to protect myself, no longer serves either purpose. What happened in 1962 wasn't an ending. It was a threshold I crossed without understanding the terms. And I need to say, before I can't say anything at all, that the creatures we call Sasquatch are not what we think they are. They're not animals. They're not monsters. They're something we don't have a category for. And one of them made sure I would never forget that. Before that day, hunting wasn't a hobby for me. It was identity. It was inheritance. My grandfather, Emmett Patterson, guided elk hunts in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest starting in 1911. My father took his first buck at age 9. I took mine at 10 in 1948, using my father's rifle, a Winchester Model 70 he'd carried through the war. That rifle came home from Europe without a scratch. I cleaned it every month whether I'd fired it or not. By 1962, I'd spent 24 years in those mountains. I knew the ridgelines. I knew where the deer bedded down in August and where they moved when the first snow came. I could read tracks the way some men read newspapers. Not just what animal, but how long ago, how fast it was moving, whether it knew something was following it. People in town called me when they had a predator problem. I tracked a cougar for the Fenwick family in 1959 after it took 2 of their calves. Found it in 11 hours. I wasn't the best shot in the county, but I was the most patient. I understood the woods the way you understand your own home in the dark. You don't think about where the furniture is. You just know. That version of me ended on August 14th, 1962. I remember the date because it was a Tuesday, and I'd taken the day off from the mill specifically for this. I'd been tracking a blacktail buck for 3 weeks. Spotted him twice, both times at a distance. Mature male, heavy rack, moving through the lower elevations near Mosquito Creek. I wanted that deer the way some men want a promotion. It wasn't about meat. It was about the completion of something I'd started. I left the house at 4:30 in the morning. My wife, Helen, was still asleep. I kissed her forehead, grabbed the Winchester, and drove the logging road as far as I could before the grade got too steep. I hiked in the rest of the way. 2 miles, maybe a little more. The air was cool, clean. Douglas fir and western hemlock, thick enough that the canopy filtered the early light into something soft and gray. By 7 a.m., I'd found his trail. Fresh scat, tracks in the damp soil near a creek bed. He was moving east, paralleling the ridge. I followed. For 3 hours, it was perfect. The kind of hunt that makes you feel like you're part of something older than roads or towns or the mill whistle. Just you, the animal, and the old agreement between the two. And then the woods stopped. I don't mean I stopped. The woods stopped. The birds went silent first. I noticed it the way you notice a clock stopping, the absence of something you didn't realize you were hearing. Then the insects, then the wind. The forest didn't fade into quiet. It was cut like someone had thrown a switch. I'd felt this once before, years earlier, when a black bear wandered close to my stand. Prey animals go silent when a predator is near. But this was different. That time, I could still hear the wind. I could still hear my own boots in the undergrowth. This time, I couldn't hear anything. I stopped walking. I didn't decide to stop. My body made the choice before my mind caught up. My hands tightened on the rifle. I scanned the tree line, slowly, the way you're trained to do. Look for shapes that don't belong. Look for movement. I didn't see anything, but every part of me, every instinct I'd honed over 2 decades, screamed the same message. You are being watched. That's when I knew. I wasn't the hunter anymore. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was pressure. I've tried to explain this to myself 1,000 different ways over the years, and it always comes back to the same inadequate word: wrong. The forest felt wrong the way a photograph feels wrong when the proportions are slightly off. Everything looked normal. The trees were still trees. The shadows were still shadows. But the absence of sound turned it into a stage set, something mimicking the woods instead of being the woods. I stood there for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Time moved strangely. My training said, identify the threat. My instinct said, leave. I compromised. I took 3 slow steps backward, keeping my eyes forward, rifle ready, not aiming at anything. There was nothing to aim at, but prepared. I reached the creek bed I'd crossed 10 minutes earlier. The water was low, just a trickle over smooth stones. I stepped into it, and the sound of my boot on the wet rock was so loud it made me flinch. That's when I smelled it. Musk. Organic animal, but not like anything I'd encountered. Not bear, not cougar, not elk and rut. Stronger, thicker. The kind of smell that doesn't just reach your nose, it coats the back of your throat. I turned my head to the left, following the scent. 50 yards uphill, standing in a gap between 2 old-growth firs, it was there. I'm going to say this as plainly as I can. I didn't see a bear standing on its hind legs. I didn't see a man in a costume. I didn't see a shadow I misidentified. I saw a living creature, 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, standing completely motionless, with its arms at its sides, looking directly at me. We made eye contact. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough that I registered details. Long enough that my mind tried and failed to categorize what I was seeing. The hair wasn't uniform. It was longer on the shoulders and arms, shorter on the face and chest. The face was flat, not like a bear's muzzle, not like an ape's protruding jaw. Somewhere between. The eyes were deep set, dark and focused with an intensity I'd only seen in humans. Not the blank stare of an animal, not the predatory focus of something about to attack. Curiosity. It was looking at me the way I'd looked at the buck I'd been tracking, studying, assessing. My hands were shaking. I realized I'd raised the rifle without thinking, the barrel pointing at the ground halfway between us. Not a threat, not a defense, just a reflexive gesture, the way you reach for a railing when you lose your balance. The creature's eyes flicked down to the rifle, then back to my face. It tilted its head, just slightly. The way you tilt your head when you're trying to understand something. I should have run. Every part of my body was telling me to run, but I couldn't. But I move. It wasn't fear that held me, though there was fear, cold and sharp in my chest. It was something else, a kind of recognition. Not that I'd seen this thing before, but that it had seen me, that it knew I was there, knew I was afraid, and was choosing not to act. The silence held. And then, without sound, without warning, it turned and stepped back into the trees. It didn't crash through the brush. It didn't lumber or stumble. It moved with a fluidity that something that size shouldn't possess. And within 3 seconds, it was gone. The forest stayed silent for another 10 seconds. Then all at once, the birds came back. The insects resumed. A breeze moved through the canopy, and the leaves rustled like nothing had happened. I stood in that creek bed, water soaking through my boots, and tried to breathe. I am 84 years old. What I am going to describe happened in 1962, but I can still see it with the clarity of something that occurred this morning. After that silence fell, after every living thing in those woods went still, I stood frozen with my rifle hanging useless at my side. My body understood something my mind was still trying to deny. I was being watched. Not the way an animal watches, not with the calculating patience of a predator sizing up prey. This was different. This was examination. I turned slowly. The movement felt like pushing through water. It stood at the tree line, maybe 40 yards distant. The underbrush at that spot was thick with salal and sword fern, and behind it rose a stand of old-growth Douglas fir with trunks wide enough that 3 men couldn't link hands around them. The creature used this backdrop deliberately. It positioned itself where the shadows were deepest. But it wanted me to see it. The first thing that struck me was the size. I had hunted black bear in those mountains. I had field-dressed elk that weighed 600 pounds. This made them look small. It stood upright, not hunched or crouched, but fully vertical, and its head cleared 7 feet easily, maybe 8. The shoulders were massive, sloped with muscle that suggested power I couldn't quantify. The second thing was the stillness. It didn't shift weight, didn't adjust its stance, didn't blink or twitch. It held itself with a control that seemed almost meditative. I have watched deer freeze when they sense danger, watched cougars go motionless before a strike. This was neither of those. This was a being choosing to be still. The hair covering it was dark reddish-brown, shaggy and uneven, thicker across the chest and shoulders, not fur like a bear's. Hair. I could see the way it moved slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel down where I stood. But it was the face that changed everything. I expected something monstrous, if I expected anything at all. I expected fangs or distorted features or blank animal eyes. What I saw was a face. Not human. I won't claim that. The brow was heavy, the jaw pronounced, the nose flat and broad. But there was structure to it, symmetry. The eyes were deep set beneath that prominent brow ridge, and they caught the filtered light coming through the canopy. And they looked directly at me. I have been watched by animals my entire life. I know what it looks like when a predator assesses you. I know the empty gaze of something that processes you purely as threat, or food, or irrelevance. This was none of those. There was thought behind those eyes, intention. The creature was studying me the same way I had studied countless tracks and scat and broken branches, trying to understand what I was doing there, what I represented. I raised my rifle without thinking. Pure instinct. Decades of training. The creature didn't run. It tilted its head, slightly, maybe 10 degrees to the left. The movement was slow, deliberate. It looked at the rifle, then back at my face. And I understood, in a way that bypassed language entirely, that it knew exactly what the rifle was. It knew what I could do with it. And it was choosing not to react with aggression. It was waiting to see what I would do. My hands started shaking. I lowered the rifle. The creature straightened its head, still watching, still motionless, except for that one gesture. We stood like that for a time I can't accurately measure. It might have been 30 seconds. It might have been 3 minutes. My sense of time had come completely unmoored. Then it did something I have never been able to reconcile. It raised one arm, slowly, the same measured pace as the head tilt, and extended one massive hand toward me, not reaching, not gesturing me forward or waving me away, just showing me the hand. The palm was lighter than the rest of it, gray-brown, deeply lined. The fingers were long, the proportions almost human but scaled up and thickened. I could see calluses. I could see what looked like dirt or moss stained into the creases. It held the hand there for a long moment, then it lowered the arm back to its side. I don't know what that gesture meant. I have spent 60 years trying to decode it. A greeting? A demonstration of non-aggression? Proof of its own intelligence? Showing me it had hands that could manipulate and create? Or was it asking me to see it as something more than an animal? My legs finally obeyed me. I took one step backward, then another. The creature didn't follow. It stayed exactly where it was, watching me retreat. I backed up 10 yards before I trusted myself to turn around. When I did turn, I forced myself not to run. Some deep instinct told me that running would change the terms of what was happening. So I walked, quickly, but I walked. I made it maybe 30 paces before I heard the sound behind me. Not a roar, not a growl, a low, resonant hum, almost a vocalization, but wordless. It rose and fell in a pattern that felt like speech without being speech. It carried through the still air and seemed to vibrate in my chest. I stopped. I don't know why. I should have kept moving. The sound came again. Same cadence, same tone. Then I understood. It was calling to me, trying to communicate something with the only tool it had that might bridge the gap between us. I didn't turn around. I started walking again, faster now. Behind me, the humming stopped, and the silence, that awful, suffocating silence that had emptied the forest of every living sound, remained absolute. I moved through that silent forest like a man underwater. My legs worked. My lungs pulled air. But everything felt muffled and distant and wrong. The creek was 30 yards ahead. I had crossed it on the way in, stepping across on exposed stones. Clear water running over smooth river rock, maybe 8 feet wide. The sound of it had been pleasant that morning, natural. Now I couldn't hear it at all. I stumbled down the bank and my boot hit the water and there was no splash. The creek was still flowing. I could see the current moving around my feet, but it made no sound. That silence had swallowed everything. I stepped onto the first rock. My boot slipped. I caught myself on a second stone, knee-deep now in water I couldn't hear. My rifle was still in my right hand, and I shifted it to keep it dry, moving it up and across my body. That's when my father's compass fell out of my shirt pocket. I heard that. In all that impossible quiet, I heard the small metallic sound of the silver case hitting stone underwater. The silence broke just enough to let that one noise through, and then closed again immediately after. The compass had been my father's. He carried it through France in 1918. He gave it to me the week before he died in 1955, closed my hand around it, and told me it would always bring me home. I wore it every time I entered the woods. I looked down into the water. The current had already moved it. I could see the silver glinting between 2 stones about 3 feet downstream, lodged in a gap. I took a step toward it. Then I felt the gaze again. It was behind me, close behind me, closer than it had been at the tree line. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. I left the compass. I lunged across the remaining stones and scrambled up the far bank, boots slipping on moss, grabbing at sword fern to pull myself up. I hit the top of the bank and I did run then. I ran the way a man runs when something fundamental inside him breaks and the body takes over. I don't know how long I ran. The trail blurred, my lungs burned. Branches whipped past my face and I didn't feel them. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed against the base of a massive cedar, gasping, and that's when the forest came back to life, all at once. The silence didn't fade gradually. It lifted like a curtain. Birds erupted into song. I heard the chittering of a squirrel somewhere above me. The wind moved through the branches. Somewhere distant, a raven called. The ordinary sounds of the woods returned as if they had never left. I stayed against that tree for 20 minutes. My heart rate slowly dropped back toward normal. My hands eventually stopped shaking. And with the return of normal sound came the return of normal thought. I had left my father's compass in that creek. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had carried that compass for 7 years. I had made a promise to my father's memory that I would keep it safe. And I had abandoned it. But I couldn't go back. Not alone. Not today. I made it to my truck an hour later. I drove home. I didn't speak to my wife about what happened. I cleaned my rifle and put it in the cabinet and locked it and went to bed. The next morning I returned to those woods with my brother-in-law. I told him I had dropped something valuable and needed help finding it. He asked questions. I didn't answer them. We hiked in together. The forest was normal. Birds sang. Squirrels moved through the branches. The creek made the sound creeks make. We reached the crossing point and I showed him where I had fallen. We both waded into the water and searched the stones. We searched for 40 minutes. The compass was gone. The current must have dislodged it, I told him. It was lost. He suggested we search downstream. I told him no. We went home. 3 days later, I went back alone. One final time. I didn't cross the creek. I stopped at the bank and I stood there for a long time, looking at the water and the stones and the trees beyond. And that's when I saw it. 30 feet down the trail I hadn't taken, the path that ran parallel to the creek on the far side, there was a stump. Old growth, cut decades before, maybe 4 feet across. Moss covered most of it in a thick green blanket. On top of that stump, placed directly in the center, where a shaft of morning sunlight came down through a gap in the canopy, sat my father's silver compass. I crossed the creek without thinking. I walked to the stump in a daze. The compass had been polished. The silver case gleamed in the sunlight. There wasn't a scratch on it. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. The engraving on the back, my father's initials, was clearly visible. This was definitely mine. I opened the case. The glass face was clean. The needle moved freely, pointing north. Someone had taken this compass from the creek bed, cleaned it, polished it, and placed it here deliberately. Not dropped. Not left carelessly. Placed. Positioned in the sunlight where I would see it the moment I came down this path. I looked around slowly. The forest was empty. The morning sounds continued undisturbed. Birds, wind, the creek. But I knew I was being watched. The creature from 3 days ago, it had followed me to the creek. It had seen me drop the compass. It had watched me abandon it and run. And then it had retrieved it. Not to keep. Not to examine as a curiosity or claim as a prize. It had cleaned it and returned it in a way that ensured I would find it, placed with care in a spot of beauty and light. This was not the action of an animal. This was communication. A message delivered in the only language available. Action and symbol. The creature was showing me that it understood the object held value. That it recognized my distress when I dropped it. That it meant me no harm. It was showing me intelligence, empathy, intention. I stood there holding my father's compass for a long time. Then I put it in my pocket, turned around, and walked out of those woods. I never went back. Not to hunt, not to hike, not for any reason, because I understood something that morning that I have never been able to fully articulate. I had been given a gift, not the compass. I already owned that. The gift was the return of it. The gift was the message, and the only way I could honor that gift was to leave that place alone. Silas drove home that afternoon with the compass gripped in his right hand, still damp from the creek. His knuckles were white around the steering wheel. He didn't remember the drive. He only remembered pulling into his driveway and sitting in his truck for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, before his wife came out to check on him. She asked if he was hurt. He said no. She asked if he got his buck. He said no. She asked what happened. He looked at her and felt the words die in his throat before they could form. What could he say? That something in the forest had watched him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. That it had moved through the trees without a sound, then tracked him to the creek. That it had picked up his father's compass, carried it somewhere, and placed it in a spot where he couldn't possibly miss it. He couldn't say any of it, not because she wouldn't believe him, because he didn't know how to make sense of it himself. "I'm tired," he told her, "just a long day." That night he locked the compass in his desk drawer and sealed his rifle in the gun cabinet. He didn't touch either one for 3 years. The decision to stay silent wasn't immediate. For the first few weeks, he turned the encounter over in his mind constantly, trying to find a version of events that made sense. A bear that coincidentally crossed the creek near where he'd dropped the compass. A person, some hermit or drifter, playing a strange joke on him. Exhaustion, dehydration, panic. None of it held. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what had happened. What stopped him from speaking wasn't fear of ridicule, though that was part of it. In 1962, you didn't tell people you'd seen a monster in the woods and expect to be taken seriously. You kept your head down, did your work, and didn't give folks a reason to question your judgment. But the real reason ran deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had been a message, not a threat, a boundary. The creature had every opportunity to harm him. It was faster, stronger, and knew the terrain better than he ever could. But it hadn't pursued him when he ran. It hadn't cornered him at the creek. Instead, it had done something that required patience, intention, and a level of thought Silas couldn't reconcile with any animal he'd ever known. It returned the compass. That single act carried more weight than the sighting itself. It was deliberate. It was careful. It said, without words, "I could have kept this. I could have done worse. But I'm giving it back. Now leave." Silas understood. He was being told that the forest wasn't his. He'd been tolerated there for years, but that tolerance had limits. The creature had drawn a line, and the compass was proof that the line was real. So he stayed away. He never hunted that area again. He never told anyone why. As the years passed, the fear began to shift into something else. Not exactly respect, though that was part of it. Something closer to protectiveness. He thought about what would happen if he told his story. If people believed him, and that was a big if, they wouldn't respond with curiosity or caution. They'd respond with rifles and dogs and trucks full of men eager to prove themselves. They'd tear through those woods looking for proof, for a body, for a trophy to mount on a wall. The thing that had spared him would be hunted, not studied, not respected. Hunted. Silas had been a hunter his entire life. He understood the difference between taking an animal for food and killing something just to prove it existed. What he'd encountered wasn't game. It wasn't an animal in the way people understood animals. It had shown him a kind of intelligence that made him feel small and ignorant, and he couldn't be the reason it was destroyed. His silence became a vow, not out of loyalty to the creature, exactly, out of recognition that some things were bigger than him, older than him, and deserved to be left alone. He deflected questions with the same line every time. The woods aren't the same anymore. People assumed he meant logging or development or the changing times. He let them believe that. It was easier than the truth. Only once did he come close to speaking. His youngest son, maybe 12 years old, asked him why the rifle stayed locked up. Why they never went hunting together like other fathers and sons. Silas almost told him, He opened his mouth and felt the weight of 60 years of silence pressing down on him. Then he looked at his son's face, still soft with childhood, and realized he didn't want to pass that weight forward. "Some things are better left alone," he said. "You'll understand when you're older." His son never asked again. Now, at 84, Silas wonders if he made the right choice. The creature is long dead by now, almost certainly. Whatever it was, it couldn't still be alive after 6 decades. But the memory hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown sharper with age, more insistent. And there are the objects. He doesn't talk about those either. Not yet. But they've made him reconsider everything he thought he understood about that day in 1962. Maybe the encounter didn't end when he left the forest. Maybe it was never supposed to. Silas didn't grow up hearing stories about Sasquatch. His family came from German and Irish stock, homesteaders who cleared land and built farms and saw the forest as something to be worked, not feared. The old tales his grandfather told were about wolves and hard winters and men who drank themselves to death. Nothing about creatures in the trees. But the land he hunted in 1962 had belonged to other people long before his family arrived. The Salish and Lummi tribes had lived in those forests for thousands of years, and they had their own stories. Silas didn't hear those stories until much later, and when he finally did, they made his blood run cold. Not because they were frightening, because they explained everything. In the traditions of the Coast Salish people, Sasquatch isn't a monster. It isn't even an animal, not in the way white settlers understood animals. The word they used, Tsemekwes in some dialects, described something closer to a person, a different kind of person, one that lived apart from humans, kept to the deep forest, and demanded respect. They weren't creatures to be hunted. They were beings to be left alone. Some tribes considered them protectors of the land, guardians who maintained balance in places humans shouldn't disturb. Others saw them as another tribe entirely, one that had chosen a different path, and interactions with them were governed by the same protocols as encounters with neighboring peoples: caution, respect, and an understanding that trespassing had consequences. The stories didn't frame Sasquatch as hostile. They framed them as powerful. There's a difference. Silas learned this in the late 1980s, almost 30 years after his encounter. He was at a diner in Bellingham and overheard a conversation between 2 men at the next table. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and a quiet voice, was talking about his grandfather's teachings. He mentioned Tsemekwes. He described them as people who walked a different road, and said his grandfather had always warned him not to go too deep into certain areas, not because of danger, but out of respect for boundaries. Silas sat frozen with his coffee, halfway to his mouth. He wanted to turn around and ask questions, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Instead, he listened until the men finished their meal and left. That night, he went to the library. He found books on Coast Salish culture, anthropology texts, collections of oral histories. He read everything he could find about indigenous perspectives on Sasquatch, and the more he read, the more his own experience made sense. The creature hadn't attacked him because it had no reason to. He'd wandered into its territory, yes, but he hadn't desecrated anything. He hadn't destroyed habitat or killed recklessly. He was just another hunter passing through, and the creature had treated him accordingly. A warning, a clear message, and a boundary enforced without violence. The compass wasn't a threat, it was diplomacy. That realization reshaped everything Silas thought about that day. For decades, he'd carried the encounter as a source of fear and confusion, something that didn't fit into the world as he understood it. But the indigenous framework offered a different lens. The creature wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a system, a relationship between humans and the land that his own culture had never taught him to recognize. He thought about the silence he'd kept in the indigenous stories. That silence wasn't cowardice. It was respect. Speaking carelessly about Tsemekwes, drawing attention to their presence, inviting outsiders into their territory, that was the violation. Silence was the appropriate response. Silas had made the right choice, even if he hadn't known why at the time. There's a specific account he came across years later, recorded by an anthropologist in the 1970s. An elder from the Lummi Nation described an encounter his uncle had experienced as a young man. The uncle had been fishing alone near a remote creek when he saw a figure watching him from across the water. Tall, covered in dark hair, motionless. The uncle didn't run. He acknowledged the figure with a nod, gathered his things slowly, and left without looking back. He never returned to that spot. The elder explained that his uncle understood what the figure was and what the moment meant. It was a reminder that the land had older inhabitants, and their tolerance was not an invitation. Silas read that account 3 times. It could have been describing his own encounter, beat for beat. The difference was that the Lummi man had a cultural context to process what happened. He knew the rules. He knew what the figure represented. Silas had been stumbling blind through an interaction his own culture had, erased from memory. Western science approaches Sasquatch as a zoological mystery, a missing link, an undiscovered primate, a fossil record waiting to be completed. It asks, what species is this? Where does it fit in the evolutionary tree? How do we capture one? Indigenous knowledge asks different questions. What is our relationship to this being? What responsibilities come with sharing the land? How do we coexist without causing harm? Silas didn't have the language for it in 1962, but he'd instinctively followed the latter approach. He'd recognized that the encounter wasn't about dominance or discovery. It was about boundaries and respect. The creature had taught him something his own culture couldn't, and he'd honored that teaching by staying silent. Now, decades later, he wonders if the old stories knew something else too. Because in some of those traditions, Tsemekwes aren't just individuals. They're part of a network, a community that communicates across distances and remembers. If that's true, then the creature Silas met in 1962 might have passed along a message of its own, not a warning to others of its kind, a marker, a designation. This one understands. This one can be trusted. And maybe that's why, all these years later, the objects keep appearing. The compass didn't just reappear, it was returned. That distinction matters. It's the difference between coincidence and intent, between natural phenomenon and conscious action, between animal and something else entirely. Silas understood this immediately, even as his rational mind fought against it. An animal might pick up a shiny object out of curiosity, might carry it a short distance, but what Silas found that day wasn't dropped carelessly or abandoned after losing interest. It was placed, deliberately, in a location he would find it, polished clean of creek mud, positioned upright. For 60 years, he's turned that moment over in his mind, searching for an explanation that doesn't require him to accept what it implies. He's never found one. What he witnessed wasn't human intelligence wearing a different face. It was something distinct, something we don't have categories for. The creature didn't build a fire or fashion tools. It didn't attempt spoken language or replicate human behavior. What it demonstrated was contextual awareness, the ability to recognize that the compass mattered to Silas, that he had lost it during his flight, and that returning it would communicate something more complex than words could convey. That requires theory of mind. The capacity to understand that another being has thoughts, intentions, and emotional attachments separate from your own. We've documented this ability in great apes, elephants, dolphins. But those demonstrations happen in controlled environments, after years of human interaction and training. What Silas encountered showed this same cognitive sophistication in a creature he'd never seen before in a single brief interaction in the wild. The message wasn't simple. It wasn't, "I found your possession." It was layered. It said, "I understand this object has value to you. I am capable of restraint despite your intrusion. I am establishing a boundary, not through violence, but through demonstration of power and intelligence. I could have harmed you. Instead, I am showing you what I am." We classify intelligence along human metrics, language complexity, tool creation, social structures that mirror our own, but intelligence shaped by different evolutionary pressures, different environmental needs, different survival strategies, that would look alien to us, wouldn't register on our measurement systems. Consider what the encounter actually demonstrated. The creature tracked Silas through dense forest without being detected until it chose to reveal itself. It assessed his threat level accurately. An armed human, experienced in these woods, capable of violence. It made a calculated decision not to attack despite Silas being in its territory. It monitored his movements after the initial confrontation. It recovered a small metal object from a creek bed. It understood the object's significance without cultural context. It chose a specific location for the return that created maximum psychological impact. Each of these actions requires sophisticated cognitive processing. Strung together, they suggest a form of awareness we haven't accounted for. Researchers who study symbolic communication in Sasquatch encounters document patterns Silas's experience fits precisely. Wood knocks that seem to convey territorial boundaries. Whistles that appear to coordinate movement between unseen individuals. Tree structures, massive formations of bent trunks and woven branches that serve no practical purpose, but clearly required intention and effort to create. These aren't random. They're deliberate constructions meant to communicate to something capable of interpreting them. The structures, in particular, challenge our assumptions. Large trees, some over 6 inches in diameter, twisted and arched to form X shapes or archway formations. The force required exceeds what a human could accomplish without equipment. But the precision suggests purpose beyond mere strength. They mark territories. They indicate areas to avoid. They possibly convey information we don't have the framework to decode. Silas's returned compass belongs to this same category of symbolic gesture. It wasn't functional communication. No exchange of concrete information occurred. It was conceptual. A demonstration that said, "I exist in a way you didn't think possible." Many indigenous cultures have known this for generations. Their oral traditions don't describe Sasquatch as undiscovered animals. They describe them as another form of people. Different, powerful, deserving of respect and distance. Forest guardians who maintain boundaries between human and wild spaces. The Lummi Nation calls them Tisamekwes. The Spokane know them as Snana. The Chehalis refer to them as simply the Old Ones. Across tribes, the pattern repeats. These are not beasts to be hunted. They are intelligences to be acknowledged and left alone. Western science dismissed these accounts as folklore, mythology born from misidentified bears and campfire stories. But Silas's experience suggests something different. That indigenous knowledge preserved accurate information about a phenomenon science refused to investigate seriously because it didn't fit existing models. We wanted Sasquatch to be Gigantopithecus, a relic hominid, flesh and blood, explainable through evolutionary biology. We could accept an undiscovered primate, rare, elusive, but ultimately just another animal waiting to be cataloged. What Silas encountered resists that classification. The atmospheric changes he described, The unnatural silence, the sense of displacement, the quality of light that seemed wrong, appear repeatedly in encounter reports. Researchers call it the Oz factor, a shift in environmental perception that accompanies high strangeness events. Some witnesses report electronic equipment failing, compasses spinning, cameras malfunctioning, time distortion where minutes feel like hours or vice versa. These details don't align with a biological entity, no matter how rare. They suggest something operating partially outside normal physical parameters. Not supernatural, but perhaps utilizing aspects of reality we haven't developed the scientific vocabulary to describe yet. Silas doesn't claim to understand what he met. He's careful about that. He only insists on what he knows. The creature possessed awareness beyond animal cognition. It communicated through action rather than language. It demonstrated restraint that required moral consideration, not just instinct. And it changed him in ways that never faded. That last detail matters. Encounters with mere animals don't restructure someone's entire worldview, don't create decades-long transformations in behavior and belief, don't produce the kind of existential weight Silas has carried since 1962. Whatever intelligence he faced in those woods, it recognized him as something more than prey, and he recognized it as something more than predator. That mutual recognition, that moment of seeing and being seen by an awareness you didn't believe possible, that's what haunts him. Not the fear of what it could have done, but the knowledge of what it chose not to do. Silas thought it ended when he left the forest. For decades, that assumption held. He moved on with his life, married, raised children, built a career in carpentry far from hunting grounds. The encounter became something sealed in the past. Transformative, but concluded. Then 15 years ago, at age 69, he found the first gift. He doesn't call it that lightly. Gift implies intent, exchange, relationship. But no other word fits what he discovered at the edge of his property that morning in 2009. His home sits on 5 acres in rural Washington, cleared land surrounded by second-growth timber. Not the deep wilderness of his 1962 encounter, but not suburban either. Isolated enough that neighbors are measured in quarter miles. He'd walk the property line, checking fence posts after a storm. Found a section where blackberry brambles had been cleared away, not cut, but carefully pulled aside and woven into a tight bundle. Strange, but he assumed kids or perhaps deer. Then he saw what sat beneath the cleared space. A piece of bark roughly 8 inches square, covered in deliberate patterns. Curved lines scored into the surface with something sharp. Symmetrical designs that repeated with clear intention. Too precise to be random, weathering, or animal damage. He picked it up, turned it over. The back was unmarked. Someone had created this, then placed it specifically in the one cleared spot along 30 yards of dense bramble. For him to find. He brought it inside, showed his wife, who suggested local kids playing pranks. He wanted to believe that, spent a week convincing himself of it. Then he found the second one. Different location, same property line. Another cleared area, another bark piece. This one had what looked like a crude sun symbol carved into it. A circle with radiating lines. Over the following months, 7 more appeared, always at the property boundary, always in spots made visible through deliberate clearing. Each one marked with different patterns, spirals, cross-hatching, arrangements of dots. Someone was leaving him messages, and the property line placement meant something. Boundary recognition, territorial awareness, the same principle as those tree structures researchers document. Markings that say this far, no farther. But these weren't warnings. The careful placement, the artistic effort, The consistent return, it felt more like acknowledgement, like something saying, I know, I remember. Then the objects changed. He found feathers, not scattered randomly like bird molt, but arranged. 3 hawk feathers laid parallel across a flat stone. A crow feather stuck upright in soft ground, positioned to catch light. Placements that required hands and intention. The wooden figures started appearing 2 years ago. Crude carvings, each 4 to 6 inches tall. Humanoid shapes whittled from green wood with a blade or sharp stone. No fine detail, but the proportions were consistent. Thick torso, heavy arms, head without defined features. The postures varied, some standing, others in crouched positions. They looked like totems, like representations of the carver itself. Silas keeps them in a locked drawer, hasn't shown them to many people. His wife passed 3 years ago, and his children think he's declining into paranoid isolation. They've suggested he sell the property and move into senior housing. He refuses, because he knows what's happening, and leaving won't stop it. The phenomenon researchers call habituation follows patterns. Silas's experience matches exactly. Repeated interactions at a specific location, over months or years. Incremental trust building through non-threatening encounters. Exchange of objects or food. The sense that something is observing, learning, establishing relationship. Most habituation reports involve people who actively encourage contact. They leave food offerings, build structures, spend hours in the woods attempting communication. Silas never did any of that. He moved to this property decades after his encounter, never seeking further contact. Whatever is leaving these objects found him, sought him out, recognized him despite time and distance. The implications disturb him more than the original encounter. It means the 1962 creature wasn't acting alone, wasn't isolated. It belonged to a community that shares information, that marks certain humans as known entities, that maintains awareness across generations and geography. The figures especially trouble him. They began appearing after his wife died, after he started spending more time alone on the property, after he became visibly older, slower, more vulnerable. They feel like reassurance, like something saying you're watched over, you're not forgotten. That depth of continuity requires memory, culture, transmission of knowledge between individuals across decades. The folklore Silas dismissed his whole life suddenly makes horrible sense. Stories about people being marked by encounters with powerful entities, about gifts and protections that follow them, about bargains they never agreed to but can't escape. Indigenous traditions speak of this phenomenon directly. Certain individuals become known to the Sasquatch. They're observed but not harmed, sometimes given signs, sometimes protected from other dangers in the forest. The relationship isn't requested and can't be refused. You're chosen, and that choice stays with you. Silas thought returning the compass was mercy, an acknowledgement that he'd learned his lesson and would stay away. Now he wonders if it was something else, a marker, a scent, a designation that said, "This one is known to us." And others have honored that designation ever since. The gifts don't frighten him the way the original encounter did, but they unsettle him more deeply, because fear has an end point. You survive the threat, and it's over. This isn't over. This has never been over. For 62 years, he's been part of something he didn't agree to and doesn't fully understand. He's checked with neighbors. No one else finds objects. No one else reports cleared brambles or strange carvings. Whatever is leaving these things targets his property specifically, his boundary line, his awareness. Last month he found the most elaborate piece yet. A wreath woven from fresh cedar boughs, hung from a low branch at eye level, directly on the path he walks most mornings. The weaving technique was complex, over-under patterns that required dexterity and patience. It hung there 3 days before wind finally broke it down. He didn't touch it, didn't bring it inside. Some part of him understands that accepting the gifts more actively would deepen the relationship, would constitute response. He spent 60 years not responding, staying silent, maintaining distance. But distance doesn't seem to matter to whatever is on the other side of this exchange. They know where he is. They've always known, and they want him to know that they know. Silas Patterson is 84 years old. He left that forest in 1962 and never returned to the region. He moved 300 miles south. He built a quiet life. He kept his vow of silence. But 15 years ago, something changed. He woke one morning to find a small object on his fence post. A single hawk feather, perfectly intact, positioned upright, wedged carefully into a crack in the wood. He removed it. The next week, another appeared in the exact same spot. Then came the weavings, intricate constructions of cedar bark and grass, twisted into patterns he couldn't replicate, not hanging from branches, placed deliberately on the ground at his property line, where the mowed lawn meets the edge of the woods. Always at the boundary, never closer. He burned the first few. They kept appearing. Then he found the figures, small humanoid shapes carved from single pieces of wood, crude but unmistakable. 2 legs, 2 arms, a head. No detail beyond basic form, but the proportions were deliberate. They were left leaning against trees, always facing his house. He doesn't believe it's the same creature from 1962. That individual would be dead by now if their lifespans mirror ours at all. His conclusion is more unsettling. They know who he is. Somehow, the creature from that summer marked him, and others of its kind recognized that mark decades later. They are reminding him the boundary still exists. The vow he made is still in effect. The encounter never ended. It simply changed form. This phenomenon has a name in Sasquatch research: habituation sites. Locations where witnesses report years-long, low-intensity interactions with what they believe is a family group living nearby. These accounts describe patterns, objects left in specific places, structures built from branches, a persistent sense of being observed but not threatened. The relationship, if it can be called that, operates on non-human terms. No direct contact, no escalation, just ongoing, patient reminders of presence. Silas's experience fits this framework, but with a critical difference. Most habituation sites develop organically, starting with repeated sightings in one location. His began 60 years ago in a different forest and followed him across state lines. That suggests something more deliberate, more intentional. Folklore from dozens of cultures describes the concept of being marked by powerful entities. In Irish tradition, those who encounter the Fae and survive may find themselves recognized by other Fae for the rest of their lives. In some Native American accounts, individuals who are spared by certain spirits carry that interaction like a scent, detectable by others of their kind. The mark isn't physical, it's something deeper, a recognition that passes between beings we don't understand, confirming that someone has already been judged, and the terms of that judgment are being honored. The objects left at Silas's property line are not gifts. He's clear on that. They don't feel like offerings. They feel like reminders, confirmations, evidence that he is still seen, still remembered, and that the silence he has kept for 60 years is acknowledged. He moved the carved figures once, placing them in a box in his shed. Within days, new ones appeared in the exact same locations. He stopped moving them. The alternative explanation, that he is fabricating this, or misinterpreting random natural occurrences. collapses under his own resistance to the narrative. He doesn't want this to be happening. He doesn't tell neighbors. He didn't mention it to his children until this year. He describes the objects with clinical detachment, the way someone might describe symptoms of a disease they didn't ask for. This is not the behavior of someone seeking attention. This is the behavior of someone living under terms he cannot break and did not choose. What terrifies him most is not the objects themselves. It's what they confirm. That the creature from 1962 communicated something about him to others. That there is a network, a continuity, a culture among them sophisticated enough to pass information across time and geography. That he exists within their awareness in a way he will never fully understand. He was 22 when it happened. He is 84 now. For 62 years, that single decision, to accept the returned compass, to leave the forest, to stay silent, has governed his life. And it will govern it until he dies. The encounter did not end when he crossed the creek. It relocated. It adapted. It followed him, not as threat, but as fact. An ongoing reminder that he was seen, spared, and bound by that mercy. Some doors once opened do not close. Silas Patterson still keeps his father's compass. It sits on his kitchen table now, no longer hidden. He holds it while he talks, turning it over in his hands. The silver is worn smooth from 60 years of handling. He didn't come forward for attention. He came forward because he's 84. And the silence has become heavier than the secret. Because he believes we've spent a century asking the wrong questions about Sasquatch, looking for the wrong kind of evidence, preparing for the wrong kind of discovery. We've been hunting for an animal. He met something else. He says the woods hold intelligences we've disrespected, dismissed, and fundamentally misunderstood. That we've treated their territory as empty space, their existence as folklore, their silence as absence. He says the creatures we call Sasquatch are not hiding from us out of fear. They are withdrawing from us out of judgment. And some of them, for reasons we will never fully understand, still choose mercy. He broke his silence as both warning and confession. A warning that contact with these beings carries consequences that outlast the encounter itself. A confession that he has lived 60 years under terms he cannot explain, marked by an intelligence that operates beyond our framework, held to a vow he made in terror, and has honored ever since. The compass was returned. The boundary was drawn. The silence was kept. And somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, and perhaps in smaller woods, much closer than we think, they are still watching, still waiting, still deciding who deserves mercy and who does not. We've been asking whether Sasquatch exists. Silas Patterson forces a harder question. If they do, are we ready to accept what that existence means? Not animals to be documented, not mysteries to be solved, but intelligences with their own rules, their own judgments, their own long memory. He's 84 years old. The objects still appear at his property line. The encounter has never ended, and he will carry that compass until the day he dies.